Hello everyone, happy Friday, and welcome to the next chapter of the Legend of Drizzt, which is going to be the start of Part 3, which is entitled The Academy. And it's leading to the next stage in our friend Drizzt's wonderful life. So, we're going to go ahead and we're going to hop into it here. So, if you missed yesterday, basically it was uh, Drizzt's mother and sisters seeking to take away his innocence before he left for the academy, and so having him kill what he thought was a fellow Drow warrior, but was really a goblin slave in disguise. So Drizzt has spilled his first blood, and Zachnafine is upset about that fact. So. And he's not too keen about Drizzt going to the academy because he thinks it'll ruin the innocent spirit that his protege slash secret son has going on. So he contemplated killing him in their final sparring match, but excuse me, that didn't wind up coming to pass. And so now Drizzt is off to the academy, and we'll see what happens to him there. Here we go. Part 3. The Academy. The Academy. It is the propagation of the lies that bind Drow society together, the ultimate perpetration of falsehoods repeated so many times that they ring true against any contrary evidence. The lessons young Drow are taught of truth and justice are so blatantly refuted by everyday life in wicked Menzoberranzan that it is hard to understand how any could believe them. Still, they do. Even now, decades removed, the thought of the place frightens me. Not for any physical pain or the ever-present sense of possible death. I've trod down many roads equally dangerous in that way. The Academy of Menzoberranzan frightens me when I think of the survivors, the graduates, existing, reveling, within the evil fabrications that shape their world. They live with the belief that anything is acceptable if you can get away with it, that self-gratification is the most important aspect of existence, and that power comes only to she or he who is strong enough and cunning enough to snatch it from the failing hands of those who no longer deserve it. Compassion has no place in Menzoberranzan, and yet it is compassion, not fear, that brings harmony to most races. It is harmony working toward shared goals that precedes greatness. Lies engulf the Drow in fear and mistrust, refute friendship at the tip of a Lolth-blessed sword. The hatred and ambition fostered by these amoral tenets are the doom of my people, a weakness that they perceive as strength. The result is a paralyzing, paranoid existence that the Drow call the edge of readiness. I do not know how I survived the Academy, how I discovered the falsehoods early enough to use them in contrast, and thus strengthen those ideals I most cherish. It was Zachnafine, I must believe, my teacher. Through the experiences of Zac's long years, which embittered him and cost him so much, I came to hear the screams of protest against murderous treachery, the screams of rage from the leaders of Drow society, the high priestesses of the Spider Queen, echoing down the paths of my mind, ever to hold a place within my mind. The screams of dying children. Drizzt Do'Urden. Chapter 12. This Enemy, They. Wearing the outfit of a noble son, and with a dagger concealed in one boot, a suggestion from Dinan, Drizzt ascended the wide stone stairway that led to Tir Bresh, the Academy of the Drow. Drizzt reached the top and moved between the giant pillars, under the impassive gazes of 2 guards, last year students of Melee-Magthere. 24 other young Drow milled about the Academy compound, but Drizzt hardly noticed them. 3 structures dominated his vision and his thoughts. To his left stood the pointed stalagmite tower of Sorcerer, the school of wizardry. Drizzt would spend the first 6 months of his 10th and last year of study in there. Before him, at the back of the level, loomed the most impressive structure, Arach Tinolith, the School of Lolth, carved from the stone into the likeness of a giant spider. By Drow reckoning, this was the Academy's most important building, and thus was normally reserved for females. Male students were housed within Arachnolith only during their last 6 months of study. While Sorcerer and Arachnolith were the more graceful structures, the most important building for Drizzt at that tentative moment lined the wall to his right, the pyramidal structure of Melee-Magthere, the School of Fighters. This building would be Drizzt's home for the next 9 years. His companions, he now realized, were those other dark elves in the compound, fighters like himself, about to begin their formal training. The class, at 25, was unusually large for the School of Fighters. Even more unusual, several of the novice students were nobles. Drizzt wondered how his skills would measure up against theirs, how his sessions with Zaknafine compared to the battles these others had no doubt fought with the weapons masters of their respective families. Those thoughts inevitably led Drizzt back to his last encounter with his mentor. He quickly dismissed the memories of that unpleasant duel, and, more pointedly, the disturbing questions Zack's observations had forced him to consider. There was no place for such doubts on this occasion. Melee-Magthere loomed before them, the greatest test and the greatest lesson of his young life. "My greetings," came a voice behind him. Drizzt turned to face a fellow novice, who wore a sword and dirk uncomfortably on his belt, and who appeared even more nervous than Drizzt. A comforting sight. "Kelnaz of House Kenefin, 15th House," the novice said. "Drizzt Do'Urden of Dair Monash as Bernon, House Do'Urden, 9th House of Menzoberranzan," Drizzt replied automatically, exactly as Matron Malice had instructed him. "A noble?" remarked Kelnaz, understanding the significance of Drizzt bearing the same surname as his house. Kelnaz dropped into a low bow. "I am honored by your presence." Drizzt was starting to like this place already. With the treatment he normally received at home, he hardly thought of himself as a noble. Any self-important notions that might have occurred to him at Kelnaz's gracious greeting were dispelled a moment later, though, when the masters came out. Drizzt saw his brother Dinan among them, but pretended, as Dinan had warned him not to notice, nor to expect any special treatment. Drizzt rushed inside Melee-Magthere along with the rest of the students when the whips began to snap, and the masters started shouting of the dire consequences if they tarried. They were herded down a few side corridors and into an oval room. "Sit or stand as you will," one of the masters growled. Noticing two of the students whispering off to the side, the master took his whip out and, crack, took one of the offenders off his feet. Drizzt couldn't believe how quickly the room then came to order. "I am Hatchnet," the master began in a resounding voice, "the master of law. This room will be your hall of instruction for 50 cycles of Narbondel." He looked around at the adorned belt on every figure. "You will bring no weapons to this place." Hatchnet paced to the perimeter of the room, making certain that every eye followed his movements attentively. "You are drow," he snapped suddenly. "Do you understand what that means? Do you know where you come from, and the history of our people? Menzoberranzan was not always our home, nor was any other cavern of the Underdark. Once we walked the surface of the world." He spun suddenly and came up right in Drizzt's face. "Do you know of the surface?" Master Hatchnet snarled. Drizzt recoiled and shook his head. "An awful place," Hatchnet continued, turning back to the whole of the group. "Each day as the glow begins its rise in Narbondel, a great ball of fire rises into the open sky above, bringing hours of a light greater than the punishing spells of the priestesses of Loth." He held his arms outstretched, with his eyes turned upward, and an unbelievable grimace spread across his face. Students' gasps rose up all around him. "Even in the night, when the ball of fire has gone beyond the far rim of the world," Hatchnet continued, weaving his words as if he were telling a horror tale, "one cannot escape the uncounted terrors of the surface. Reminders of what the next day will bring, dots of light, and sometimes a lesser ball of silvery fire, mar the sky's blessed darkness. Once, our people walked the surface of the world," he repeated, his tone now one of lament. "In ages long past, even longer than the lines of the great houses. In that distant age, we walked beside the pale-skinned elves, the fairies." "It cannot be true!" one student cried from the side. Hatchnet looked at him earnestly, considering whether more would be gained by beating the student for his unasked-for interruption, or by allowing the group to participate. "It is," he replied, choosing the latter course. "We thought the fairies our friends. We called them kin. We could not know, in our innocence, that they were the embodiments of deceit and evil. We could not know that they would turn on us suddenly and drive us from them, slaughtering our children and the eldest of our race. Without mercy, the evil fairies pursued us across the surface world. Always we asked for peace, and always we were answered by swords and killing arrows." He paused, his face twisting into a widening, malicious smile. "Then we found the goddess." "Praise Lolth!" came one anonymous cry. Again, Hatchnet let the slip of the tongue go by unpunished, knowing that every accenting comment only drew his audience deeper into his web of rhetoric. "Indeed," the master replied. "All praise to the Spider Queen. It was she who took our orphaned race to her side and helped us fight off our enemies. It was she who guided the 4 matrons of our race to the paradise of the Underdark. It is she," he roared, a clenched fist raising into the air, "who now gives us the strength and the magic to pay back our enemies." "We are the Drow!" Hatchnet cried. "You are the Drow, never again to be downtrodden, rulers of all you desire, conquerors of lands you choose to inhabit." "The surface?" came a question. "The surface," echoed Hatchnet with a laugh. "Who would want to return to that vile place? Let the fairies have it. Let them burn under the fires of the open sky. We claim the Underdark, where we can feel the core of the world thrumming under our feet, and where the stones of the walls show the heat of the world's power." Drizzt sat silent, absorbing every word of the talented orator's often rehearsed speech. Drizzt was caught, as were all the new students, in Hatchnet's hypnotic variations of inflection and rallying cries. Hatchnet had been the master of lore at the Academy for more than 2 centuries, owning more prestige in Menzoberranzan than nearly any other male drow and many of the females. The matrons of the ruling families understood well the value of his practiced tongue. So it went every day, an endless stream of hate rhetoric directed against an enemy that none of the students had ever seen. The surface elves were not the only target of Hatchnet's sniping. Dwarves, gnomes, humans, halflings, and all of the surface races, and even subterranean races such as the Duergar dwarves, which the drow often traded with and fought beside, each found an unpleasant spot in the master's ranting. Drizzt came to understand why no weapons were permitted in the Oval Chamber. When he left his lesson each day, he found his hands clenched by his sides in rage, unconsciously grasping for a scimitar hilt. It was obvious from the commonplace fights among the students that others felt the same way. Always, though, the overriding factor that kept some measure of control was the master's lie of the horrors of the outside world, and the comforting bond of the students' common heritage. A heritage, the students would soon come to believe, that gave them enough enemies to battle beyond each other. The long, draining hours in the Oval Chamber left little time for the students to mingle. They shared common barracks, but their extensive duties outside of Hatchnet's lessons, serving the older students and masters, preparing meals, and cleaning the building, gave them barely enough time for rest. By the end of the first 10 day, they walked on the edge of exhaustion, a condition, Drizzt realized, that only increased the stirring effect of Master Hatchnet's lessons. Drizzt accepted the existence stoically, considering it far better than the 6 years he had served his mother and sisters as page prince. Still, there was one great disappointment to Drizzt in his first 10 days at Melee-Magthere. He found himself longing for his practice sessions. He sat on the edge of his bedroll late one night, holding a scimitar up before his shining eyes, remembering those many hours engaged in battle play with Zaknafine. "We go to the lesson in 2 hours, Kelnaz in the next bunk reminded him. "Get some rest." "I feel the edge leaving my hands," Drizzt replied quietly. "The blade feels heavier, unbalanced." "The Grand Melee is barely 10 cycles of Narbindel away," Kelnaz said. "You'll get all the practice you desire there. Fear not, whatever edge has been dulled by the days with the Master of Lore will soon be regained. For the next 9 years, that fine blade of yours will rarely leave your hands. Drizzt slid the scimitar back into its scabbard and reclined on his bunk. As with so many aspects of his life so far, and he was beginning to fear with so many aspects of his future in Menzoberranzan, he had no choice but to accept the circumstances of his existence. This segment of your training is at an end, Master Hatchnet announced on the morning of the 50th day. Another master, Dinan, entered the room, leading a magically suspended iron box filled with meagerly padded wooden poles of every length and design comparable to drow weapons. Choose the sparring pole that most resembles your own weapon of choice, Hatchnet explained as Dinan made his way around the room. He came to his brother, and Drizzt's eyes settled at once on his choice. 2 slightly curving poles about 3.5 feet long. Drizzt lifted them out and put them through a simple cut. Their weight and balance closely resembled the scimitars that had become so familiar to his hands. For the pride of Dermon Ashesbernon, Dinan whispered, then moved on. Drizzt twirled the mock weapons again. It was time to measure the value of his sessions with Zack. Your class must have an order, Hatchnet was saying as Drizzt turned his attention beyond the scope of his new weapons. Thus, the Grand Melee. Remember, there can only be one victor. Hatchnet and Dinan herded the students out of the Oval Chamber and out of Melee-Magthere altogether, down the tunnel between the 2 guardian spider statues at the back of Tir Bresh. For all of the students, this was the first time they had ever been out of Menzoberranzan. What are the rules? Drizzt asked Kelnaz, in line at his side. If the master calls you out, then you're out, Kelnaz replied. The rules of engagement? Asked Drizzt. Kelnaz shot him an incredulous glance. Win, he said simply, as though there could be no other answer. A short time later, they came into a fairly large cavern, the arena for the Grand Melee. Pointed stalactites leered down at them from the ceiling, and stalagmite mounds broke the floor into a twisting maze filled with ambush holes and blind corners. Choose your strategies and find your starting point, Master Hatchnet said to them. The Grand Melee begins in a count of 100. The 25 students set off into action, some pausing to consider the landscape laid out before them, others sprinting off into the gloom of the maze. Drizzt decided to find a narrow corridor to ensure that he would fight off 1 against 1, and he just started off in his search when he was grabbed from behind. A team? Kelnaz offered. Drizzt did not respond, unsure of the others' fighting worth and the accepted practices of this traditional encounter. Others are forming into teams, Kelnaz pressed. Some in 3s. Together, we might have a chance. The master said there could only be one victor, Drizzt reasoned. Who better than you, if not me? Kelnaz replied with a sly wink. Let us defeat the others, then we can decide the issue between ourselves. The reasoning seemed prudent, and with Hatchnet's count already approaching 75, Drizzt had little time to ponder the possibilities. He clapped Kelnaz on the shoulder and led his new ally into the maze. Catwalks had been constructed all around the room's perimeter, even crossing through the center of the chamber to give the judging masters a good view of all the action below. A dozen of them were up there now, all eagerly awaiting the first battle so that they might measure the talent of this young class. 100! Cried Hatchnet from his high perch. Kelnaz began to move, but Drizzt stopped him, keeping him back to the narrow corridor between 2 long stalagmite mounds. Let them come to us, Drizzt signaled in the hidden hand and facial expression code. He crouched in battle readiness. Let them fight each other to weariness. Patience is our ally. Kelnaz relaxed, thinking he had made a good choice in Drizzt. Their patience was not tested severely, though, for a moment later a tall and aggressive student burst into their defensive position, wielding a long, spear-shaped pole. He came right in on Drizzt, slapping with the butt of his weapon, then spinning it over, full into a brutal thrust designed for a quick kill. A strong move, perfectly executed. To Drizzt, though, it seemed the most basic of attack routines. Too basic, almost, for Drizzt hardly believed that a trained student would attack another skilled fighter in such a straightforward manner. Drizzt convinced himself in time that this was indeed the chosen method of attack and no feint, and he launched the proper parry. His scimitar poles spun counterclockwise in front of him, striking the thrusting spear in succession and driving the weapon's tip harmlessly above the striking line of its wielder's shoulder. The aggressive attacker, stunned by the advanced parry, found himself open and off balance. Barely a split second later, before the attacker could even begin to recover, Drizzt's counter poked one, then the other scimitar pole into his chest. A soft blue light appeared on the stunned student's face, and Drizzt followed its line up to see a wand-wielding master looking down at them from the catwalk. "You are defeated," the master said to the tall student. "Fall where you stand." The student shot an angry glare at Drizzt, and obediently dropped to the stone. "Come," Drizzt said to Kelnaz, casting a glance up at the master's revealing light. "Any others in the area will know of our position now. We must seek a new defensible area." Kelnaz paused a moment to watch the graceful hunting strides of his comrade. He had indeed made a good choice in selecting Drizzt, but he knew already, after only a single quick encounter, that if he and this skilled swordsman were the last two standing, a distinct possibility, he would have no chance at all of claiming victory. Together, they rushed around a blind corner, right into two opponents. Kelnaz chased after one, who fled in fright, and Drizzt faced off against the other, who wielded sword and dirk poles. A wide smile of growing confidence crossed Drizzt's face as his opponent took the offensive, launching routines similarly basic to those of the spear wielder that Drizzt had easily dispatched. A few deft twists and turns of his scimitars, a few slaps on the inside edges of his opponent's weapons had the sword and dirk flying wide. Drizzt's attack came right up the middle, where he executed another double poke into his opponent's chest. The expected blue light appeared. "You are defeated," came the master's call. "Fall where you stand." Outraged, the stubborn student chopped viciously at Drizzt. Drizzt blocked with one weapon and snapped the other against his attacker's wrist, sending the sword pole flying to the floor. The attacker clenched his bruised wrist, but that was the least of his troubles. A blinding flash of lightning exploded from the observing master's wand, catching him full in the chest and hurtling him 10 feet backward to crash into a stalagmite mound. He crumpled to the floor, groaning in agony, and a line of glowing heat rose from his scorched body, which lay against the cool gray stone. "You are defeated," the master said again. Drizzt started to the fallen drow's aid, but the master issued an emphatic "No!" Then Kelnaz was back at Drizzt's side. "He got away," Kelnaz began, but he broke into a laugh when he saw the downed student. "If a master calls you out, then you're out," Kelnaz repeated into Drizzt's blank stare. "Come," Kelnaz continued. "The battle is in full now. Let us find some fun." Drizzt thought his companion quite cocky for one who had yet to lift his weapons. He only shrugged and followed. Their next encounter was not so easy. They came into a double passage turning in and out of several rock formations, and found themselves faced off against a group of 3, nobles from leading houses, both Drizzt and Kelnaz realized. Drizzt rushed the 2 on his left, both of whom wielded single swords, while Kelnaz worked to fend off the third. Drizzt had little experience against multiple opponents, but Zack had taught him the techniques of such a battle quite well. His movements were solely defensive at first, then he settled into a comfortable rhythm and allowed his opponents to tire themselves out, and to make the critical mistakes. These were cunning foes, though, and familiar with each other's movements. Their attacks complemented each other, slicing in at Drizzt from widely opposing angles. "Two hands," Zack had once called Drizzt, and now he lived up to the title. His scimitars worked independently, yet in perfect harmony, foiling every attack. From a nearby perch on the catwalk, Masters Hatchnet and Dinan looked on. Hatchnet more than a little impressed, and Dinan swelling with pride. Drizzt saw the frustration mounting in his opponents' faces, and he knew that his opportunity to strike would soon be at hand. Then they crossed up, coming in together with identical thrusts, their sword poles barely inches apart. Drizzt spun to the side and launched a blinding uppercut slice with his left scimitar, deflecting both attacks. Then he reversed his body's momentum, dropped to one knee, back in line with his opponents, and thrust in low with 2 snaps of his free right arm. His jabbing scimitar pole caught the first and the second squarely in the groin. They dropped their weapons in unison, clutched their bruised parts, and slumped to their knees. Drizzt leaped up before them, trying to find the words for an apology. Hatchnet nodded his approval at Dinan as the two masters set their lights on the two losers. "Help me!" Kelnaz cried from beyond the dividing wall of stalagmites. Drizzt dived into a roll through the break in the wall, came up quickly and downed a fourth opponent, who was concealed for a backstab surprise, with a backhand chop to the chest. Drizzt stopped to consider his latest victim. He hadn't even consciously known that the drow was there, but his aim had been perfect. Hatchnet blew a low whistle as he shifted his light into the most recent loser's face. "He is good," the master breathed. Drizzt saw Kelnaz a short distance away, practically forced down to his back by his opponent's skilled maneuvers. Drizzt leaped between the two and deflected an attack that surely would have finished Kelnaz. This newest opponent, wielding two sword poles, proved Drizzt's toughest challenge yet. He came at Drizzt with complicated feints and twists, forcing him on his heels more than once. "Burgunyon of House Bainry," Hatchnet whispered to Dinan. Dinan understood the significance, and hoped that his young brother was up to the task. Burgunyon was not a disappointment to his distinguished kin. His moves came skilled and measured, and he and Drizzt danced about for many minutes with neither finding any advantage. The daring Burgunyon then came in with an attack routine perhaps most familiar to Drizzt, the double thrust low. Drizzt executed the cross down to perfection, the appropriate parry as Zaknafine had so pointedly proved to him. Never satisfied, though, Drizzt then reacted on an impulse, agilely snapping a foot up between the hilts of his crossed blades and into his opponent's face. The stunned son of House Bainry fell back against the wall. "I knew the parry was wrong!" Drizzt cried, already savoring the next time he would get the opportunity to foil the double thrust low in a session against Zack. "He is good," Hatchnet gasped again to his glowing companion. Dazed, Burgunyon could not fight his way out of the disadvantage. He put a globe of darkness around himself, but Drizzt waded right in, more than willing to fight blindly. Drizzt put the son of House Bainry through a quick series of attacks, ending with one of Drizzt's scimitar poles against Burgunyon's exposed neck. "I am defeated," the young Bainry conceded, feeling the pole. Hearing the call, Master Hatchnet dispelled the darkness. Burgunyon set both his weapons on the stone and slumped down, and the blue light appeared on his face. Drizzt couldn't hold back the widening grin. Were there any here he could not defeat, he wondered. Drizzt then felt an explosion on the back of his head, and dropping him to his knees. He managed to look back in time to see Kelnaz walking away. "A fool," Hatchnet chuckled, putting his light on Drizzt, then turning his gaze upon Dinan. "A good fool." Dinan crossed his arms in front of his chest, his face glowing brightly now in a flush of embarrassment and anger. Drizzt felt the cool stone against his cheek, but his only thoughts at that moment were rooted in the past, locked on to Zaknafine's sarcastic but painfully accurate statement. "It is our way." And there we go. That will be tonight's chapter, and the last chapter for us for the week. So, I hope everybody has a good weekend that we're going into. I hope everybody is staying safe and staying healthy, and I will see everybody on Monday for our next chapter. Have a good weekend, everyone. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.